Hello, friends, and welcome to the October 1st edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Attenip, your host and Texas Impact's Outreach Director, and today's episode is being brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas. And we are excited today for our conversation with Rev Dr Derrick Harkins, the National Director for Interfaith Outreach with the Democratic National Committee, previously Vice President at Union Theological Seminary. And I'll introduce Derrick in just a second. But before we jump in, I have a couple of quick announcements for today. First, we have been in awe at the response to our Faith and Democracy series with events so far in Dallas, Houston, Corpus Christi, and Huntsville. Those will all be available very soon in the Weekly Witness podcast feed, as well as our YouTube channel. So make sure that you check out that content and share with your friends and congregations. Make sure to hit the subscribe button while you're at it. Each one of those events has had panel discussions featuring faith leaders, conversations about policy, strategies for voting. So you'll want to make sure that you check out those panels, especially for the areas you're interested in. Also, this is your final reminder that the voter registration deadline in Texas is October 5th. So make sure that your friends and networks are registered, and go ahead and quadruple check to make sure that you are still registered, even if you just voted in the primaries. You can find resources for you and your congregation to help promote safe and accountable voting using the Texas Impact's Texas Faith Votes campaign at texasimpact.org. That campaign has a ton of tools for you and your congregations, including a checklist for those wanting safe and accountable voting. It has links there to check your registration, to register voters, to recruit attorneys and poll monitors for early voting and election day. Second, we have a challenge to recruit election workers. Third, we have a pledge to vote in the November election based on our shared faith values of health equity, immigration, climate, and a rejection of discrimination. And finally, a resource and a publication for those interested in voting by mail. Y'all, this is a vital time for Texans of faith to raise our voices. We have to advocate for issues that we care about, and one way that we do that is by participating in democracy at the ballot box. Now's the time. We have to be doing the work over the next several weeks. So I hope we can all covenant together today to make that positive change. Texas Impact would love to help resource you or answer questions that you have. You can always email me at scott@texasimpact.org. And since we do have a live audience today, just really quick, I know we've done Zoom like 1,000 times, all of us, I'm sure. But just a reminder that you can have conversation with your fellow attendees using the chat function. Make sure that you're sending those comments to both attendees and participants. But if you have a question specifically for Derrick today, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the conversation today. So with all of that, Derrick, I appreciate you allowing me the time at the beginning to make those announcements. Welcome to the conversation, Reverend Dr. Derrick Harkins. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it, Scott. Well, I was a pastor for many, many years, so I know all about the importance of announcements.
Right. And I guess we should also give a shout out to the fact that you were a pastor here in Texas for a while, right?
I was, proudly so, in Dallas. I served for 5.5 years at the New Hope Baptist Church, which is the oldest African-American church in Dallas, and has always been a significant part of the landscape there, and just so glad that I still have a slew of wonderful friends there and friends in Texas overall.
All right. Well, really appreciate you making the time for us today. Let's start out with the first question dealing with your seminary background. So we talked with one of your former students who gave you a shout out a couple weeks ago, Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, and we had a conversation with him. But we talked about the fact that when the secular media discusses faith in the public square, they often do it through the lens of white evangelicals. So as someone with extensive experience in academia and seminaries, what role do you believe mainline seminaries and other religious educational institutions have in training and equipping faith leaders to participate in civic life, and are they meeting that challenge currently?
That's a great question. I think that the challenge is an ever-changing one. I guess the first word that comes to mind is intersectionality, meaning that we need to understand how faith communities, faith leaders, faith institutions overall are relevant and have the potential for being relevant in so many realms of our social context, our societal context. And I think it's important to equip people with that understanding. You're right that I think that oftentimes the religious right is sort of the default perspective that's given over to understanding what faith means, especially in an American social context. You know, I'm a Baptist, and oftentimes I say it tongue in cheek, but I actually am saying it with some aim toward accuracy, that I will say to people, I'm a Baptist, but maybe not necessarily the kind of Baptist you think of when you see the news and those who are making headlines, et cetera. So I think it's important for those persons who are part of that larger conversation that they understand that the role and the presence of faith is essential in so many elements. And you are seeing it. There is obviously a significant presence in the overall public conversation that the religious right occupies. But I do think that there's more and more of a broader conversation. And it's not even so, it's not as simple as progressive versus conservative, left versus right. I think it's fair to say that within faith communities, there's a wide range of understanding around a number of issues that weave in and out of one's faith convictions. And so I don't think it's fair to just simply call it left, right, but I think it's important to see that there are voices other than those who are identified presently as the right wing.
So is there anything that, we have a lot of faith leaders who are listening to this. We have a lot of seminary folks that I'm sure will be listening as well. Is there something we can do to encourage them to make changes to help local congregations be better engaged in some of these issues or some of this work?
It's basic. And when I say it's basic, I think one of the things is helping people to get a grasp on the key issues and the relevant issues on a number of these issues. For example, something that obviously is germane in not just in Texas, certainly the rest of the country, but certainly in Texas, when you talk about immigration and its implications. And what are the key issues that a faith community ought to not only be aware of, but have an understanding of how they might engage in them when it comes to the health security, and which is sadly something we've been seeing talked about or written about quite a bit in the last couple of weeks. But the health security of immigrants who find themselves in custody. What do we need to do when it comes to the issue of family separation? How are those things, for example, woven into the presence and the witness of faith communities? And I think it's easier for again, faith communities to understand how they play a part when they see the part that they need to play.
That's interesting that you do it through the frame of immigration, because we actually did partner with some seminaries and institutions to bring about 100 clergy down to the border to meet with asylum seekers and then go to DC to have conversations about that. So yeah, getting people outside of normal ministry context and letting them meet marginalized folks is certainly important. So next question, the white evangelicals seem to have a very formidable infrastructure for mobilizing their members around conservative causes. Do you agree with that assessment? And what can mainline and progressive religious institutions do to respond?
I hope your audience doesn't mind me being frank.
I think you'll be all right.
I think I'll be okay. I think it's easier in the sense for conservative evangelicals to do that, because the scope and the breadth of issues that can sort of really be seen as concise rallying points are fairly narrow. There are several that obviously can be seen as the rallying cry. I think that the challenge, and I don't mean challenge in a negative sense, but the challenge in the broader faith community, certainly in the progressive faith community, is that the issues that we see as critical and important and urgent are much broader in their spectrum. They aren't just simply the issues of reproductive choices or sexuality. And so I think it's important to understand that you have to have a much broader conversation for faith communities that would maybe see themselves as outside of the realm of conservative and evangelical. a much broader conversation with them about the issues that they see as important and how they would engage around those issues. I think, it's it's deeply unfortunate that people, and I'm not saying this because I'm thinking it, I'm saying it because people have said it outright, that people can compromise the framework of their moral, ethical, and even theological kind of underpinnings because they can consort with an individual or individuals who may be, in their estimation, champion one or two given issues over and above anything else, and without seeing any of the inadequacies in the rest of the conversation. I think that's unfortunate, but I think that goes to that answers, at least in my estimation, the question of why sometimes it's so much more readily easy for, say, the evangelical white church to coalesce.
Do you feel like that's changing at all right now? I mean, just anecdotally, I feel like I've heard from some friends that idea might be shifting some.
It is. And I'm not the pollster on the campaign. There are others who do that far better than I ever could. But we do see, absolutely we see shifts that have happened in significant ways. And when I say significant ways, I mean, for example, a 5 to 10 percent shift amongst evangelicals in terms of what their political affinity is going to be in this election cycle and beyond is huge, and could in some places really determine the outcome. So it is happening, and it's happening on that level in terms of obviously the kind of the nuts and bolts of political polling and what we see there. But maybe even more so, and maybe even more importantly, it is happening in the context of the larger sets of issues that are seen as crucial and critical. I just talked a minute ago about the fact that they're the sort of the two cardinal issues amongst conservative evangelicals that are kind of a rallying point. But we are seeing over and over and over again, especially amongst younger individuals who identify as evangelical, that certainly the issues around sexual identity are not nearly kind of the automatic third rail that they used to be. That shift has changed, slowly changing, but nevertheless changing to a degree that it's not even noticeable, but it's formidable.
I feel like I just played into my own critique there, though. I got some feedback. It's been probably more than a year now that we had a white evangelical pastor come on the podcast and talk about the shifting view of evangelicals on immigration. And I got feedback from some of my mainline religious folks who said, why do we have to highlight that the evangelicals are shifting on this? Like, we've been there for decades, right? And why are we not highlighting the fact that the mainline faith community has already been there? So I don't know, I guess I'm just calling myself out a little, right?
I would just say, I think both things are obviously critical and important. I think it's important, obviously, to talk about the ongoing and significant work, as you're right, that mainline communities have been doing, you're right, for many years. But I do think it's probably important to note that shift, because it speaks to not only the fact that the hearts and minds maybe of evangelicals are shifting, but that the tectonic plates, if you will, are shifting. And so I think it's important to note it. I mean, you don't have to necessarily say, well, this is what I'm going to celebrate to the exclusion of what mainline churches have been doing forever. But I think it merits being noted for sure.
Yeah. So I am curious about your journey. You mentioned the fact that you have been a pastor. We've talked about the fact that you were recently in leadership at a prestigious seminary. So I am curious, what led you to leave kind of the quote unquote church side of ministry for a position in not just policy work, but in partisan politics?
Well, my first tour of duty, if you will, in politics was in the 2012 cycle when I served in the role of faith engagement director for the DNC. Of course, that was for the reelection of Barack Obama, and the landscape was quite different at that point in engagement. I always tell people that I actually appreciated being able to do that work in 2012 as opposed to 2008, because it actually took, it didn't, let's be very fair, it didn't take a heavy lift to encourage people to reelect the president. But it's certainly, there was more that needed to be done to make sure that all of that moved smoothly. This time around, I can just say that through the encouragement of the leadership at the DNC, I was asked to give consideration to coming back. And I think in part because, and this has been said many times over, and I think it's been said many times over because it is absolutely true, that this is, where I'm getting ready to go, the most important election of our lifetime. And I feel as if though whatever measure of perspective and even, dare I say, expertise that I've been able to accumulate around these issues, I thought if there was ever a point at which I wanted to say I put them to the use that they were intended to be used for, it would be now. And so I don't see such a complete chasm between obviously the work of the church, the work of the pastoral ministry, and what I'm doing now, in the sense that what I'm doing now in large measure is about engaging, educating, organizing, and mobilizing individuals who identify as part of faith communities. Yes, look, let's not be naive. Of course, I'm organizing and educating and mobilizing for them to make a very specific choice when they go into the ballot, into the voting booth. However, I think the thing that distinguishes this election cycle is that, believe it or not, I can talk to somebody about the importance of this election and never once mention the name of either the candidate who's the nominee of my party or the opposition, because I think for somebody to say, well, wait a minute, I need to vote because of my values. I need to vote because of the issues and concerns that not only affect me now, but going forth can have generational impact. And that's often enough to get people to be motivated, first and foremost, to vote, but then, of course, to make decisions that, obviously they would say are strong decisions in a direction that hopefully will bode well for us in the future. So I feel like what I'm doing now is not just sort of cynically, baldly political, but it has a larger dimension to it. And I feel like, again, this is a moment. James Russell Lowell, forgive the exclusivity of the language, but and any pulpiteer knows that we often quote James Russell Lowell in many occasions, but there's a wonderful hymn, as I just said, gender specific. We understand that once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide. And I think that we are literally at that crux. We're at that moment. And I think it is important for people to be helped in making their own choices, but at the same time making that choice. So that's the reason I feel that I find myself in the place that I'm in, even for this season.
Yeah, and with no partisan hats on, right? It seems like protecting the election, encouraging people to participate in the democratic processes, small d, serving as poll workers, election workers, all of those things now seem more important than ever, right?
No, you know what? And let me just say something. And I love the fact I'm having this conversation in Texas with all of your wonderful partners and affiliates, et cetera, there in the state. So this is very different than me. I mean, I could be sitting here and, if I was having this conversation in my home state of New York, where I am, or Connecticut or California, I could say that and it would sort of be wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Yeah, that's right. No partisanship, because, obviously we have a pretty good inkling. Or, somebody on the other side could be doing that in Tennessee or doing it in South Carolina or well, I won't say South Carolina because we may see some shifts there. But my point I'm making is this. As I say that here in Texas, to you all in Texas, I mean it. I mean the fact that the process is what is critical here. In business, do they call it a loss leader? I would love to think that everybody in the sound of our voices right now would make a determination that, I guess I would say I'm advocating. However, I really do believe, and I really mean this when I say I think the much more important thing, and I'll say this, as we see the process being stressed and stretched and intimidated, it's so critical for people to be equipped and enabled to exercise their franchise. So yes, to register to vote, to be active and part of the process is absolutely critical. And I am saying that Texas, without the partisan tinge right now, because obviously I think the larger issue and the larger good is going to serve us generationally. I mean, we know that we're looking to see what unfolds for this election cycle, but I think the larger issue about our process and about our democracy is far more important than just one single election cycle.
So let's talk about that some. Politics aside, right? What do you hope congregations will do in the next X number of 5 weeks, I guess, to ensure that we have safe and fair elections in 2020?
There are a wonderful array of tools that are available to help in equipping congregations and individuals. And even though it's been produced by us, it is not attached to support of the candidates at all, but iwillvote.com is an amazing website which allows you to do a couple of things, to check if you're registered and if you are registered, where your voting place is, and a whole slew of other things so you can be prepared to obviously to exercise your vote. So on a very practical level, helping people to understand just elementally, by way of registration. I know we are hard up against a number of registration deadlines, even as we speak.
October 5th in Texas, right?
October 5th in Texas. And I know it's in most places, I'd be surprised. I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't know that there are very many places in the country where it's past the 15th of this month. So the point is that obviously educating people and enabling people by that's square one. And then also, obviously, giving them the mechanics. We've been talking about having a plan. What's your plan? If I'm going to get an early ballot, when am I looking for it to come? Where am I going to mail it? Am I going to drop it off at the drop box that's available, if there's one available, hopefully? Am I going to vote early in person, if that's an available option? Or am I going to vote on election day even? So all of those are things that we want people, so faith entities, churches, faith communities can help by having practical kind of equipping and enabling opportunities to give people that kind of information. And then, so that's square one. That's, sort of and I mean this in the best sense, the transactional side of it. How do I get this done? The other piece, and I think this is actually more germane to just some of the things we've seen in the space of the last couple of days, I'll dare say, is helping and equipping congregations and individuals to not be intimidated by whatever sort of efforts there are toward intimidation. And it comes in many ways, whether or not people are going to say, the whole system is a sham and it's going to be a fraud, and therefore dispiriting people and making them think, what's it even worth for me to go ahead and vote? Or for them to think, well, I know if I go vote, there are going to be people maybe from the opposing political party who are going to be there in mass, quote, watching the polls, and how, does that end up being an intimidating sort of element? And so equipping people to understand all of those things, that number one, nobody has the right to infringe upon your vote. Number two, that, this issue of voter fraud and voter issues is infinitesimally small when you think about the broader scope of the volume of votes that will happen not only in Texas, but across the country. So I think churches, faith communities can do a lot. They can give people the nuts and bolts, but also kind of really equip them in the context of, being braced for what we know is already a rough and tumble political season.
So you mentioned voter intimidation and things that can go on outside of the polling location. We Texas Impact are currently recruiting poll monitors. You can find information about that on our Texas Faith Votes page. And I just did my training yesterday to become a poll monitor. I wonder if there is value in that kind of service for congregations to recruit for.
I think it's been made very clear. Yeah. And you're making me stretch my nonpartisan muscles pretty effectively here. I'm gonna do my best, but I think we heard within the last couple of days a very forward directive given for people to be poll monitors, and I'll dare say I think that the implicit nature of that was to not just simply go and be very specifically dutiful in that very prescribed role, but I'll just say I feel like there was a measure of intimidation that was added to that. Be a poll watcher and therefore scrutinize everybody that's coming in. And we know that there's a long, unfortunate, and sordid history of that happening in America. So, because that directive was sort of pushed out there from others, I think it's that much more important for people who have the intention and the focus of being ethical and fair in being a part of this process to also be at the polls.
Trained nonpartisan poll monitors, I guess, is the what I was looking for.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So are there congregations who've been doing this well? Do you have any best practices for congregations that are promoting full participation in both the election and public policy more generally, I guess?
Sure. Around the country, one of the things that I have the great pleasure of being able to do is to talk with churches, because, sort of the point of engagement for us is to talk with churches where there has been, whatever they call it, if they call it a community engagement, social justice, political awareness committee, whatever it might be that they call it, we have sort of, in many instances, touch points where we know that there are people already who are, number one, being equipped to share out information. Again, I mentioned iwillvote.com, but there are other resources as well that are able to be pushed out. And so we know that that's happening. It's happening certainly in the states where we know that this is all going to be sort of really fleshed out. I know we call them battleground states, and I might as well go ahead and use that term because that's what everybody uses. But I always look for a little bit more of a more positive kind of descriptor there. But in those states where we know, every vote counts everywhere. But in a place like Texas, where we know the scrutiny and the attention and the focus is going to be particularly high, going back to what I said a few minutes ago, we want churches to be able to equip people, yes, with the information, the metrical information, but also, as I just said earlier, to make sure that they're braced for the fact that somebody else coming there, however they come there, trying to impose and trying to intimidate, should not and cannot dissuade somebody from exercising a hard fought for and won franchise.
So I'm going to give a couple of shout outs to a couple of congregations that we've seen doing incredible work. Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas set a goal of recruiting 100 election workers to make sure that there are short lines in their neighborhood, right, in their part of Dallas. And we had one of our panelists in Corpus that was talking about souls to the poll that they're doing in Corpus. But he also said that they were going to be driving buses, but they've set a goal of 100% voter participation from their congregation. And I just learned this. I mean, I've been a Methodist for a long time, but the AME on their end of year reports has to check off how many people in their congregation voted. So
you are absolutely right. The AME Church, who we have been so fortunate to engage with on many levels, has a long-standing history of social engagement. They have a person who is their lead for that work, Jackie DuPont Walker out in California, but she works nationally and helping all of those initiatives that the AME bishops lead, but are very active in the churches. You talk about in Texas, and my good and long-standing friend of many years, my fraternity brother, Freddie Haynes, is a prime example of exactly what you're talking about, the real sort of on-the-ground engagement. Another great friend, Reverend Richie Butler at St. Luke Community United Methodist Church in Dallas as well, engaging and mobilizing and educating the membership. And one more, since we're sort of calling out a role, and you always have to be careful because you don't want to call names and then realize you're omitting others. And I'm only using these as examples. And I mentioned, you talked about my Dallas connection, so that's why I'm able to sort of talk about these are folk that I speak to on a regular basis. But Sharon Patterson at the Hamilton Park United Methodist Church. So there are plenty of examples of places, and they're in Texas, where that kind of mobilization is unfolding in a strong way. The vice chair of the Texas Democratic Party in Texas, Dr. Carla Braley, is amazing in the work that she is doing and has been doing for many years, connecting faith communities, connecting churches with the opportunity to be engaged, to have a voice. Obviously, now we're all focused on the election, but even broadly, around the issues that obviously Texas Impact is committed to. So there are great examples right there in the great state of Texas.
Well, I love that we know the same folks. Friendship West and Sharon were both part of our Faith and Democracy Dallas event. I'm not sure if they're listening right now, but somebody should tweet at them, tell them that they got name dropped in this conversation. So anything else you can think of that congregations should be doing right now? And I'll invite folks who are listening online. If you have questions, I'll try to monitor Facebook as well. Sure. If you all have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section or comments now. Anything else congregations should be doing?
Let me just say, it is going to be volume. I feel like encouraging, the best way to push back against the efforts and measures of intimidation, of suppression, etc., will be that on November 4th, that there is no lack of clarity about what has taken place at the polls. And I say that for Texas. I say that for the nation as a whole. So encouraging and reminding people of the importance of their vote. And here we go. Making sure that people understand, first of all, if there's anybody who questions or is ambivalent about the need for them for their vote, there are wonderful, the internet is full of great, I guess they'd be called memes and whatever, that point to how, so to speak, one vote over and over historically has made the difference. I mean, and when you parse it down, one vote per precinct, one vote per, et cetera. So no one can say that their vote does not count. So amplifying that messaging. And then also being able to say to people, that when you talk about the importance of voting, it is yes for this election, but we are going to the polls for what will unfold on November 3rd, but we are genuinely also going to the polls for what will unfold in these years yet to come. So I think really pressing those messages and taking advantage of the resources that are out there to make sure that people are equipped, they're informed about the process. I do know that in some states, sometimes, especially when it comes to early or quote absentee voting, there can be particulars that need to be, you need to be aware of the process fully. And one of the things that we've done at the DNC is to really make sure that again, that website, iwillvote.com. I sound like an author who's hawking their latest book. But I'm putting it out there because it's really important. And I think for people to know that the resources that are out there, to walk them through the process so that any sort of hoops or roadblocks are able to be navigated.
So we've got a question coming in that I think is a good one that we've been talking a lot about. One of the things we've talked about with the need for more election workers this year and more people to serve as poll monitors is that we want people of faith, but especially faith leaders, to understand the process just in case they need to give testimony after Election Day to the way the process worked. I guess, do you agree with that assessment, or do we need to start thinking now about the way we talk about Election Day after Election Day?
Well, one of our most formidable departments at the DNC is our voter protection department. And one of the most formidable elements of that formidable department are the attorneys who are already on the ground around the country. We are actually increasing, and I'm talking about hundreds of attorneys across the country, and especially in those places where the potential for those issues may arise going into post-election. However, so that's one. The remedy to that, and the vice president said it the other night: vote, vote, vote. And so I think that's one. But I think that, yes, being aware that we have to be attentive to the process on the other side of November 3rd and see as to what's unfolding. I think that, again, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. I feel like, when you hear people say, oh, well, this is going to have to be thrown into the courts and it's going to have to be thrown into I think in some respects that's wishful thinking on their part. I think there's a very easy remedy to that and I keep saying it over and over again, but that is for folk to show up to the polls and to show up in significant enough numbers that there's no lack of clarity about what the outcome is. But we are being equipped. We do have, and I can speak for certainly for the Democratic National Committee, we certainly have an incredibly significant presence in regard to voter protection, in regard to legal representation. We just finished, not finished because it's still ongoing, but in Wisconsin, for example, how absentee ballots will be handled there. And those are issues that arise in other places. We just talked with some folk in Ohio around the same issues. So I think that being aware of these issues, being on top of them now is part of the way we respond to it. But at the same time, obviously, the expectation would be that if there's that need come November 4th, that we do have a perspective that we're going to advocate, not advocate, we're going to demand fairness and equity in the process.
Well, and it is good that people are preparing. It seems like right now, though, at least in my mind, everybody just needs to do their part in democracy. We've been having elections for a really long time, right? Right now, we need people to prepare, organize, make a plan, show up to vote, and participate as fully in the process as you can by serving as an election worker, poll monitor, etc. Does that sound about right?
No, it does. And I feel, and people have to remember, even with obviously the issues that I've already talked about of intimidation and obfuscation of the issues, we also have the issue of a pandemic that is obviously dictating our lives in ways that no one would have imagined even, a calendar year ago. So I think that being equipped, I think, and this is weird to say it this way, but I will, it's a backhanded blessing that in and COVID-19 in no way, shape, or form is a blessing. Let me make sure that that's understood. That's not what I mean. But what I do mean is that we already know that there's an added level of attentiveness and an added level of preparedness that we need to bring to this election cycle. And so I think in understanding that, we then understand that along with that comes the awareness of these other issues. So we know that obviously polling places are not going to look the same this time around that they would normally have looked like in previous election cycles. But we at the same time also know that we're going to need to be attentive to the very issues of legitimacy.
Well, thanks for that. I want to, as we close, tap back into your pastoral role a little bit. You mentioned COVID-19. We've talked about the stresses of election season and some concerns that folks might have there. 2020 has been rough. So I wonder what word of hope you might be able to leave us with today, especially for listeners who are stressed about the current reality of the world. What word of hope might you leave us with today?
Well, it's funny. I thought about it for a few minutes. Obviously, preachers, especially when it comes to their youth sermons, are great for having visual aids. Well, I can look out in my hallway here, and there's a picture of my grandfather, my great-grandmother, and two of my great-uncles. And it was taken right around the turn of the 20th century. They were in rural Kentucky, about 100 or so, 150 miles south of Cincinnati. And when you look at the picture, as would be the case for most pictures back then, it was a studio thing where they were situated and stiffly standing in their Sunday best, even though they were the descendants of slaves and slave owners, and enslaved people, I should say, and slave owners, and then also very proud Kentuckians, maybe not politically correct today, but they were, tobacco farmers, if you will. And 1918 was sort of the point at which my grandmother and grandfather were, believe it or not, high school students. And that was the pandemic of the flu in America that killed, in the world, that killed millions of people. And not only that, coupled with the fact that they lived in the hard realities of a segregated United States, where the limitations on their capacity in so many respects were strictured by law. But there is in that picture, and I now that I'm kicking myself that I didn't take it off the wall, but there is in that picture, in their eyes, a farsightedness. They see beyond a present moment. They could never have imagined that that their grandson and great nephew would be bumping around in the East Room of the White House with regularity, or doing the things that I'm doing now as it relates to this national campaign. They could have never imagined an America in terms of those kinds of advances. And while that was something they could have never imagined, the cautionary, or I should say the word of encouragement that they would give is maybe they could imagine a nation where leaders speak in ways that incite and divide, a nation where the fractiousness is sometimes seemingly worse than it's ever been. Maybe they could have said, you know what? We've lived through times like that. And we didn't lose our grasp of the fact that there are tomorrows that are going to come. And we just need to be able to either be prepared ourselves for those tomorrows, or make sure that we pass them on in a way that is encouraging to those who will be able to have a grasp for them. And that's, you know what? That's not being sort of Pollyanna-ish. That's not being overly aspirationally optimistic. That's saying, look, I'm not going to let this present context not only define me, but defeat me. I found myself a couple of weeks ago, now 2 weeks ago, sort of having to sort of be in a pastoral function, when I remember sitting in the kitchen and my wife and I were talking, and on her phone, she gets the notice that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had passed away. And almost immediately, so many of my colleagues and friends, just the sense of a real gut punch. Oh my gosh, all is lost. I'm sort of exaggerating a little bit, but not really. But many people were saying, oh, all is lost, and this is the worst that could ever happen. I said, wait a minute, this is tough, and it's a gut blow, and there's a steep hill in front of us. But we do a disservice to those people, those folk that I'm talking about on my wall, and others. We do a disservice to them to think that we cannot navigate through these kinds of moments with resolve and with a sense, again, a grasp of what the future can be. So I really believe that. I wasn't bullied the other night. I heard bullying language, and I heard abusive language, and I saw just the epitome of what would be low in America. But guess what? I'm not going to let that determine what I see for myself, I see for my children, I see for those who I know are also committed to doing the right and the best thing. I didn't mean to give you a sermon, Scott, but when you asked that question, I just want to make sure people are braced for a future that we have a hand in. We're going to get through this. I have my own perspective on what's going to happen on November 3rd. I'm excited and enthused about what I see going on around the country, but we got to do the work. And not only that, but even if we do the work and it proves beneficial for the side that I advocate on November 3rd, we still got to do the work beyond that, because there's going to need to be healing and restoration in our country if we're going to ever be what we can be. So that's a measure of hope. I hope that people do self-care. We're going to wake up probably, if it's not immediately the day after the election, but shortly thereafter, and realize we've been through a pretty traumatic stretch, and maybe we'll be waking up on January 21st, realizing that we went through a pretty traumatic stretch. But I do think that self-care is critical.
Well, Pastor, that'll certainly preach, and I will never be one to cut off somebody giving us a word of hope. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
We did talk about self-care before you and I both got on here, and I'll say to Texas Impact listeners, post-election, after you've done all this work, we can all take a rest for a week or so, but then the Texas legislature convenes in early January, and we'll have to be ready to get to work, right? So, Dr. Harkins, thank you so much for the time and for your words today. It certainly gives us something to think about, to work towards, and we'll all remember iwillvote.com. So thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. And thanks for the hard and meaningful work that Texas Impact does all across the state.
I appreciate that. And friends, thank you all for tuning in. Make sure that you share this content with your friends and congregation. Certainly some helpful tools and advice. So we really hope that you'll pass the word along and encourage both your congregations and your networks to really get involved over the course of the next few weeks. It is that time. We've been talking about it for months. It's gut check time now, right? Everybody's got to do their part over the course of the next few weeks. So thanks for tuning in. And finally, remember, if you support the Weekly Witness community and the work of Texas Impact, you should go to texasimpact.org/join. Make sure that you and your congregation are members to support this important work. Y'all, these are anxious times, but the world needs the Texas faith community active and engaged. So let's get to work. We'll see you soon. Thanks, Kev.